Olá, sejam todos bem-vindas, bem-vindes e bem-vindos. Eu sou a Juliana e Vicente e essa é a primeira mesa do segundo dia do festival. O Relampeio é um festival internacional literário relâmpago que reúne autorias internacionais de fantasia, ficção científica e horror em debates ao vivo e gratuitos transmitidos pelo YouTube. Então inscrevam-se no nosso canal e apoie para que o Relampeio possa continuar nos próximos anos. Esse ano, então, o Relampeio conta com o apoio da Editora Aleph e com parceria da Editora Nua, Escambau Editora, Bandeirola, Agência Mage, Catarse, Fantástico Guia, Mafagafo e Eita Magazine. Também gostaríamos de lembrar que a gente está realizando, então, sorteios de livros nas nossas redes sociais, então não percam a chance de participar. Welcome, everyone. Today is the second day of the Relampeio Festival, an international literary festival that brings together international authors of fantasy, science fiction, and horror in live and free debates on YouTube. So subscribe to our channel and support it so that Relampeio can continue in the years to come. The Pix is fixed in our description below. We are holding a book giveaway. Go to our Twitter and Instagram to participate. We are here today with Qiouyi Lu from United States and Regiane Winarski and Úrsula Antunes from Brazil. Our translators for this panel are Qiouyi Lu Santos and Vanessa Guedes, and Ligia Colares is here backstage with us. The main theme of this panel will be the challenges of translating speculative fiction. And before we begin, I will describe myself physically, and after me, I'll ask all the participants to do the same and also introduce themselves. I am Juliana Vicente. I am a Black woman with dark brown curly hair. I'm using a gray blouse and an orange scarf. Behind me, you can see my door and my blue wall. I'm a PhD candidate in social communication at PUC-RS, where I've been studying creative writing and transmediality. I'm a writer, and my short stories are mostly science fiction and fantasy. I've been working with Afrofuturism as well, and I'm super happy to be here with you today. So now you can describe yourself. Can we start with S?
Hi, everyone. I'm Qiouyi Lu. I'm a Chinese-American writer and translator of speculative fiction. I'm wearing some makeup that has some traditional Chinese symbols. It's the Huadian, which was very popular in the Tang Dynasty. I mostly work from Chinese to English, but I do also do some Spanish to English translation and would love to do more of that. So it's really great to be able to meet everyone and speak to a Brazilian audience. I've been, kind of exploring a bit more of the Brazilian spec fic scene, and it's exciting to see the community here.
Thank you, Wes. Can you please now, Regiane, describe yourself and present yourself?
Hi, I'm Regiane. I've been a translator for 14 years. I translate from English to Portuguese, and I work with all kinds of books, not only speculative fiction, but it is one of my favorites, I must say. And I work full-time as a translator. It's my only job. I'm a white woman. I have long, dark blonde hair. I wear glasses. I'm wearing a black shirt. And behind me, you can see my bookshelf with some of the books I want to read. And I'm very excited to be here. It's a pleasure to be with S and Úrsula and Juliana, and with the translator from the panel. And Relampeio is a great festival. I'm so excited. Thank you.
Thank you, Regiane. Now, Úrsula, please.
So, hi, everyone. I am Úrsula Antunes. I am an author, and also proofreader and publisher and everything I can do in publishing nowadays I do. So, and I've been translating German to Portuguese literally since 1 year ago, but for the first time it was in my undergraduate. So I have some other experience in academics translating. So, and I'm very excited and very, very, very nervous because it was a long time since I debated in English with someone. So please, please apologize me with my English.
Thank you, Ursula. So our panel, as I said, is the challenges of translating speculative fiction. I prepared some questions, and we have also people that can ask their questions on YouTube. So the first question is, how did you get started with translating speculative fictions, and what languages do you translate for the audience to know? That's the first question. We can start now with Ursula.
Okay, so I translate German to Portuguese because I undergraduated in Germanistics. So, but I also do proofreading in English because I don't know if as no, but in Brazilian our steps on publishing is a little bit different. So there is translating and kind of editing of this translation. So I do this kind of editing, translating. In Portuguese, we say preparadora, okay? So I am this kind of editor of translating also in French and English. And so most of my works is in speculative fiction and classic speculative fiction also. For example, Wieland and Gustav Meyrink, that is Austrian author.
Thank you, Ursula. And Regiane, can you tell us a little bit about how did you start translating speculative fiction, and what languages do you translate?
I work basically with English. It's the only language I feel secure to translate. And there's a lot of work in English, actually. It's like the huge volume of translations in Brazil are from English. And I started my career in 2009, I think. And like, it kind of happened. We usually don't choose, especially when we're beginning, we get the opportunities that come. And I started working with young adult books, and there are many. It was a time, I think we still do have a lot of young adult books that deal with speculative fiction in general. And so the first one I translated was speculative fiction, and I just loved it. Obviously, it was the beginning of my career, so I took any kind of work that was offered to me. But it's always been one of my favorite areas of writing. And I do a lot of young adult books in speculative fiction.
Thank you, Regiane. What about you, Wes? How did you start, and what languages did you translate?
Yeah, so I think I feel like a lot of people in the United States aren't as familiar with translated work. It's not as much of a norm, but because I grew up reading a lot of Japanese comics, that I had to read translated. So I grew up just very interested in languages and translation. I speak Chinese because my family speaks it, but I mostly learned it in college. That was when I started to be more intensive about the language. And then Spanish, I was very fortunate to have a good high school teacher who was able to really get across a good understanding of the language to where I use it every day for work now. As far as translation goes, I had kind of, informally translated some fan fiction here and there for fun and, to learn. But for professional translation, it actually started with almost a coincidence, I guess, because so Qiouyi Lu, he had a short story that was going to be in a podcast for, I believe it was a reprint for Glittership, which is an LGBTQ for short fiction. So they had wanted to get someone who was able to, pronounce the Chinese terms. So I emailed Ken before the podfic, and I asked him, was there specific terms that these were supposed to be Romanized for? And, that led to me also asking him, I about.
Oops.
I think
the mic.
Can you hear us? Yeah.
No.
I think she's having some.
Her image is frozen to me.
Yeah, she looks frozen to me as well.
Yeah.
Okay, I think she's reconnecting.
There we go.
Sorry,
my tripod was pressing the button. 1 second. I'm sorry.
Oh.
It's okay.
It happens.
There we go. Okay. I'm using my iPhone as a webcam, so this is like my first time using it. It's very okay. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. Anyway, so Ken, I asked him questions about just translating as an industry, in the publishing industry, and so basically Ken offered to co-translate a story with me. Like over the course of this email conversation that was a total coincidence, Ken happened to have a manuscript that he was translating, and so we worked on it together, and through that I was able to understand a lot about the needs for translating speculative fiction. It can be a little bit different than translating non-speculative fiction because of, vocabulary, context, things like that. So yeah, it was basically a coincidence that got me talking to Qiouyi Lu, who is really great about sharing his knowledge and paying things forward.
So, thinking about this, I would like to ask you, when you first started translating, if you have any misconceptions, and if yes, what were they, like about culture or about some terms specifically, about the genre? So this time we can start with Regiane.
Okay. The thing is, I didn't think about it when I started, I got the work, I was very excited about it, and I just did it. I didn't think beforehand, this is speculative fiction. No, I mean, I was a translator in the beginning of my career, so it was just work. It's work, and I have to do my best. And so while I was doing it, and I usually don't have time to read about the story, to know what kind of thing to expect from the book that's coming. Our deadlines are very short many times. And so, I just went ahead and I did it, and I just thought about it later on. So I didn't have time to have any misconceptions or, it just happened. And I think it was great because then I didn't get to be that nervous about it. I think it was easier to just go if I didn't think, because sometimes when we think too much beforehand, it gets harder, So I think it worked well. I mean, of course, nowadays when I look at it, I'm like, oh my God, that was such a bad translation. But I think that's normal too.
What about you, Wes?
I think the biggest thing that I had to learn, but that, thankfully I did learn very quickly, is there is a balance to be made between being faithful to the work and adapting it to the audience. A lot of people do understand that things get lost in translation, but I think some people don't realize how much editing is involved. You're not just converting words from one language to another. And initially, like when I did that translation with Qiouyi Lu, I was very kind of detail oriented on making sure that every word had its, was translated basically. But the result is that because it is different languages, it can read really clunky in English or in the target language if you just kind of try to follow the grammar. Like there has to be a sense for the artistry that people expect in the target language. The example that I usually give is in Chinese, it's very common to use adverbs and adjectives. Your writing is considered kind of dull and not lively if you don't use adverbs. But in English, people tend to think if you use a lot of adverbs, it looks a little amateur. People tend to think it's a little bit unpolished. So in Chinese, they might say jumped excitedly, but in English, I could say bounced. So it's a lot about streamlining things for the target audience, but also understanding like not getting so far from the original that you change the meaning.
Yeah, and I have the feeling that this thing you mentioned as is exactly the key to a good translation. If we accept that we are not supposed to follow word by word or grammar literally, we just have to. I talk a lot about feeling when I talk about this. We have to feel what the author is trying to convey. We have to kind of get into the writing and try to use the best way to transmit the same kind of. I want the reader in Portuguese to feel the same thing that the readers in English felt when they read the original.
About you, Úrsula?
Well, actually, German to Portuguese has some kind of trouble and struggling because I think you all know that German has this large and big phrasal and vocabulary. So there is some kind of words that one word in German is like a great period in Portuguese. So sometimes it's a very challenging thing to do this translating without lose some kind of aspect that is very particular in German, and not to do something that is gonna be so boring to read. I think it's German to Portuguese and also German to other languages. The main challenge is this kind of words that is so big and has an intrinsic aspect that is so German that is complicated to translate. And also there is a lot of expressions in German that is complicated also to translate. For example, Fremdschämen, that is is ashamed because the action of the other, So there is a concept in one word in German for this, and in Portuguese we don't have. So I think it's the main problem in German is this kind of thing. And also the syntaxes in German is so different. We have declinations, and also the formulation of the phrase is the periods and the phrase. Well, it's different than Portuguese. Like in Portuguese, we have the subject, verb, and the other things. And German, it's so common to have verb to initiate the thing. So this kind of thing is a little bit complicated also.
Yeah, especially with Chinese, the grammar is very different. And sometimes I'll read something in Chinese and I'll be like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. And then I sit down to write it in English and I'm like, I don't know who this pronoun is referring to.
Yeah,
You know?
in German it's the same thing. It's the same thing in German because it's like they don't like comma in yeah, they don't like comma. It's without a comma. So in Portuguese we need comma like every time. So when we try to put this together, this make any sense. Does that make any sense? So I think it's the same problem in Chinese also.
Yeah, and also with the cultural context, I mean, there's two aspects to it. I think for one aspect in Chinese, there are a lot of idioms that are very, very culturally specific. They usually refer to, historical events or folklore that everyone is expected to know. But if you try to translate it into English, it doesn't immediately make sense because there's not that context. So you kind of have to consider, do I want to translate this faithfully and let the reader be confused? Or do I want to choose something that's maybe equivalent in English, but then I lose some of that culture? And then when you're working with sci-fi especially, people love to make up new words. Like warp drive, hyperspeed, all these new words. Sometimes they only show up in that one person's story. And there's a lot of science too. So especially with Chinese science fiction, people are very interested in the science. Sometimes science fiction stories are really just to illustrate the science. So I have to teach myself a lot of that because I don't have a background in physics, a lot of these topics. So it can be difficult in that sense because different sciences in different languages have their own vocabulary too. So in Chinese, which doesn't share that, German or Latin root with English, the terms are totally different. And I have to do extra work to even match synonyms, So it's a lot of cultural context, and I still feel like I miss a lot of it.
So people, we have some questions from the audience. So I have here a question. Paulo Vinicius F asks, in books with their own jargon, do you create a glossary to work with? How does that work in the case of longer series that could be passed to another translator?
Okay, I've done this a lot. Maybe I've been through this a lot. I have worked on books that were started by somebody else, and sometimes I start the series and they go to somebody else. And yeah, we do have this glossary thing. I think it works. It helps a lot. It also helps. Like when I work on the second book, sometimes I don't remember the things from the first. It's sometimes the gap between the first and the second is long, and we forget things. We do a lot of stuff, so it helps a lot. It's a very good way not to get lost in all the vocabulary. But sometimes we get to work with second or third books that didn't have this before. So it takes a lot of researching in PDFs, and sometimes it doesn't work so well. So the glossary thing is the best solution, I think.
Yeah, but sometimes we don't have time to do this kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and as someone, I work mostly with short fiction, so it's less of a concern for me to maintain continuity because I don't tend to pass off stories to people since they are so short. But even with short stories, I usually kind of mentally keep track. With longer books, I might start like writing it down. And my glossaries too, they're not just names and jargon and stuff like that. They could be as basic as, how am I translating this term that has multiple meanings in Chinese, but those meanings have very different connotations in English? Like, do I translate this term as teacher? Do I translate it as professor or instructor? Those kind of have very like different meanings in English, but in Chinese, they could all be the same term. So there's a lot of internal consistency that's not just jargon. It can be some very like common words as well.
Yeah.
Well,
what about you, Úrsula?
Well, I agree with us and Regiane, but also I guess the problem is not only like as said, is not only the jargon, but sometimes we have just one word and it could be a lot of things, and also the context is bring us all this probabilities, possibilities, So I guess that a glossary gonna be if it's possible to do, it is a good thing to do. But actually, we don't have this time on because time here just so sometimes it's impossible to do this.
I usually just do this as I work, I'm like, I have another document open, and I just, I have, this is the kind of thing I have to write down, and then I just open it. I mean, it takes a little time that I could be doing something else, but if I know it's going to help in the future, I think it's worth it.
Yeah, I do my translations in the writing software. I think it's only on Mac and iOS. It's called Ulysses. So it's a little bit more plain text than Microsoft Word. So and it's definitely more simple than Scrivener. But what I do is if there's, a sentence that I'm not quite so sure about my translation, or if there's something where I'm thinking about maybe, I need to make this term consistent. I put little notes in my draft and I'll like highlight them, and I can go through the highlights and kind of see the problems that are popping up again, keep notes in like a side panel. Because it is also very like a big problem with translating is you could start translating and then you reach one word and you spend 3 hours thinking about this word, So you have to also know when to say, okay, I'll deal with this later, and just keep moving on so you can finish the project.
Sometimes I read it out loud to make this make sense, and when I read out loud, that helps me a lot also.
Yeah.
Another question from the audience. Carol Vidal asked, what is the hardest to translate? Jokes, puns, rhymes? So we can start with Úrsula, maybe?
In my case, in German case, I guess it is rhymes, because oh Jesus, it's very complicated. That is not only rhymes, but the rhythm also is another rhythm. So we have to do some adaptation, and like using our Portuguese to make some kind of adaptation in the rhythm, rhyme. I guess the main problem in German is this. Also, já falei em alemão sem querer. Also, so this is the main problem, I guess, because that is some kind of pronunciations in German that is different than Portuguese, and to make sense the rhythm we have to adapt. So And jokes, but yeah, jokes. I guess we can have some kind of freedom to do this adaptation, because the context bring us this kind of freedom. If you do this literally, the audience, the readers don't understand, so we won't understand. So I guess we have some freedom to do this in jokes and puns, but rhymes is, I guess they are the main problem, specifically in German. I think so.
Well,
so what is the hardest to translate?
For me, it's the puns, because I love puns, and I always want to do my best, and I always feel like I fall short, like there's always something missing. So it makes me sad when I can't do a good job.
I think for me, Chinese has a unique challenge in that it does not use tense in grammar at all. There's not a system of marking in the language whether something occurred past, present, future. There's only an aspect system which tells you about the action. So if something is completed, you can kind of assume it's in the past. If something is in this current state, you can kind of assume it's in the present, but it's not it doesn't match the same way. There's things you can express in aspect that you can't express in tense, and vice versa. So a lot of Chinese fiction tends to wander around in time a lot more. Like, people will be doing things in the present, but maybe they'll start thinking about the past, or they'll start speculating about the future, and it all flows into each other. But when I translate it into English, I have to think about what happened first. I have to put things in order, basically. So I have to choose a tense, and that ends up being something that I do based on style rather than, anything that's more technical. For example, Ken Liu was actually a little bit baffled by, like, when I co-translated the novella, I did the parts that were in the past in present tense and the parts that were in the future in past tense. But the reason why I did that was because the parts that were in the past, they had this very literary vibe, it was more of like a intimate, interpersonal relationship type of story that I feel a lot of people like to tell in English in the present tense. But the future parts were a detective story, which I think the vibe is a lot of people will narrate that in past tense, just as a genre convention. So some things like that, which people kind of just take for granted, are actually choices, And as for puns, Chinese has a lot of puns, but either I miss them when I'm reading, or they don't show up as much. It's actually a funny situation because I can make puns in English that didn't exist in the Chinese. For example, there was a planet in a comic that I translated that was basically called like, a blue water planet in Chinese. But in English, I changed it to cerulean. So, the color cerulean, CERULEAN, but I changed the first to SEA. So it's like blue and water. So I made a pun that didn't exist because I think English readers, they like to see puns in names, and they like to see these kinds of play on words in like names and things, which Chinese names tend to be a little more straightforward. So that's an interesting opportunity.
I have to say that I'm getting very curious about Chinese. Maybe not learn Chinese, but learn a little bit about the language,
Yeah, and another story that I translated recently that was an interesting challenge was I noticed as I was reading, so the way Chinese characters are formed, they usually have a part that suggests the meaning and then a part that suggests the sound. So, anything related to water usually has the 3 dots of water on the side. So this story was about a Chinese water god and a Chinese fire god, fighting basically. And I started to notice all the words like verbs, adjectives, things like that. For each character, they had the water radical and the fire radical, which I can't do visually in English, but I can choose words that are related to water, like instead of fall, I could say flow and things like that. So there's I think translation is really fun for all the choices that you can make.
Yeah, but I'm getting the idea that with Chinese you get to work with like your brain has to be more open-minded. You have to take so much more in consideration than I do with English.
Yeah, to handle with creativity also, because I think Chinese has some the main is semantic. The idea is the main thing. So I guess creativity to translate Chinese to English is something that it's also required.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's also where a lot of people get tripped up, because they think of translation as conversion, but it's not conversion. It's more like you read the source language and you kind of parse the meaning of it, and you're trying to get that meaning in the target language. So a lot of people, they may know the source language very, very well, but if they don't know how to convey themselves in the target language well, the translation, it won't be good. It's really about understanding the meaning and trying to get that down.
So we have here a question from the audience. Paulo Vinicius F. dos Santos, our greatest fan, asks, in what way other than payment can a publisher value a translator's work?
So one thing that happens a lot in the US publishing industry is a lot of translators' names are left off of the covers. And, there's a variety of reasons why people say they do this. And, not all translators want to be on the front cover either. Some translators would prefer to be a little bit more in the background. But, I feel like it should be the option to decline that, to say, no, I don't want my name on the cover, instead of a lot of us having to fight to be acknowledged at all. So just acknowledging that translation is labor that should be credited. It's not invisible, because it is not conversion, it's an art.
Exactly. Yes, totally agree with you. Here in Brazil, most of the translations, the translators' names are not on the cover. It's very, very rare for that to happen. Our names come inside of the book. And I think this is one of the things. I mean, people have to know we are there. There's someone doing this. It doesn't happen magically. It's not like this, and then the book's in Portuguese. It's not like that. There's someone working hard, to do a very good job. Not always we do a very good job, but we're trying. We're trying hard, I've been doing this for quite some time on, especially on Twitter, talking about translators' visibility. Many people here know me from that, because I keep talking about people crediting the translator, not only the publishers, but people who influencers, booktubers, people who work with books in general. When they talk about books, they should be talking about the translator, not really necessarily evaluating the translation, but just like whenever you put the name of the book, the name of the writer, the name of the publisher, you should put the name of the translator together. I mean, this is the minimum. And I think it also it helps for us to have better professionals if we have an industry where people are concerned about the quality of the work. If the readers are if they want to have good books, good translations in books, they should value the good translators. I mean, in all kinds of jobs, we want the best professionals, and it shouldn't be different in our job. We don't want anybody doing this. We want the good ones to do the best books, not the best books, but focus on the best people possible. we want to have good translators, and we have to, I think valuing the translators has to start not only from the publishers, but from people who are reading, people who are talking about books. I mean, people are talking about books everywhere, on YouTube, on TikTok, Instagram, and we should not be left out of this.
Well, I really agree with you both. And I said in Brazil, we have the problem with credits in general, not only with translators, but also people who do all the labor in editing, like proofreaders, editors, and etc. So I guess this kind of thing should change. Translating is like another opus, it's another book you transform that original in another thing. So I think also this is the minimal, like Regiane said, it's the minimal. Yeah.
Yeah, in the US, the copyright law is that, the original author does have copyright over the original language, but the translator's translation has its own copyright because it is considered a derivative work. It's not just considered, some other version of the original. It's its own separate labor that's protected under copyright. And, I think another thing that we lose out on as an industry when we don't credit translators is people have a lot harder time finding work by translators they like, which is, people buy books because they see the author's name and they're like, oh, this is this person's book. I got to get it because I know it's going to be good. Yeah. And it should be like that for translators too.
Yes, exactly.
It's beginning to get there in that, Ken Liu has been doing a lot and people will see, oh, Ken Liu translated this, I'm going to pick it up. But you shouldn't have to be on Ken Liu's caliber to, get that kind of, basic acknowledgement, So yes. I think encouraging people to follow translators as a voice is also a very important way to navigate art.
So we have here another question. Bruno Miller said hi to Regiane, and he asked, have you ever translated more than one work by the same author and noticed how the tone changed between texts? How did you deal with this? Did you treat it like another author, or did you try to keep a consistent identity?
I think even when I'm working with the same author in many books, I've done this with Stephen King. Each book is a new book, mm-hmm. And I've translated like his first book from 1977, which was Quer, and I've translated his last book that's coming in September, and he changed a lot from 1977 to now. But it is the same person, but he's not, his writing changed. So I have to go with whatever original I have. Of course, I recognize some stuff that's typical from him, but I also see how much the writer changes and gets better. I mean, I'm talking specifically about him because he's the author I've worked the most, but I've been doing books with different writers, and it's always the same. We have to see the book we're working with as this book and not a work from this person as a whole, So I try to look at it individually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I treat every story as its own project, especially because in short fiction, there's a lot more room for people to experiment. So stories can be very, very different, even though they're from the same author. Mm-hmm. So I have translated, the same author multiple times for multiple authors. And so I do usually treat each story as its own project. The place where kind of synthesizing work across the author's career, that's more in understanding context, I would say. Like, to use Stephen King as an example, every book would be its own project, but overall, there's this understanding of how important Maine is as a setting to him, and maybe some common characters and themes that would give someone deeper context in understanding someone's work. But for the individual story itself, I treat it as its own project.
Yes.
Well, sometimes we have the same author that writes in more than one genre. So that makes that makes difference also when we translate, I guess. But in my case specifically, I did not translated a lot of the same, a lot of projects for the same author, just only Gustav Mayring. So,
Okay. We have another question from the audience. Fabio Hirata is questioning, what was the most unexpected insight you had that helped you solve a difficult word or sentence you were stuck on?
It's hard to remember.
Of course, I have a million examples, but when I'm asked, I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. It's too hard to remember.
I mean, I think that example of the story I translated with the two gods, because what was happening was they were named after the gods, so they're both like machines on Mars, machines that were developed to assist humans, and then humans left. So at first I'm like, okay, they're just named after, these figures. But as the story progresses, because, I don't often have the chance to read stories before I translate them, because I also read much, much slower in Chinese, and it would like triple my work time. I got to the end of the story and I was like, this feels like some kind of punchline, but I feel like I'm missing something. So I had to do research, and then I understood, there's a whole tradition of these two figures like duking it out and fighting. And this story happened to reference one of those legends, except set it on Mars. So sometimes I'll reach the end of the story and be like, okay, I have to do some more context, and then, go back and revise. So, understanding that context, it gave me a bigger vision of understanding what the story is trying to do, so that I can go back and reinforce the author's intent, whether by choosing the vocabulary or, just things I can do in the text. And then I don't usually include translator notes, because I prefer to kind of let the text stand on its own. But in this particular instance, as I did make the choice as a translator to provide more context, so that people could understand the story and, the last line, the punchline, so to speak. So that way, it's a window into not just this story, but the context it's in.
We have here another question. Oh, you want to talk?
No.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm trying to think of something, but nothing comes to mind. Sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. So we have a question from Ligia Colares, who's here with us. Have you ever had to translate terms that don't exist, like the writer made up, or like species, words, languages?
Yeah. Yes, sometimes it happens, and it's hard, but it's so much fun. I mean, it takes more time. That's the challenging thing. It takes more time from work. I think we have to stop and try to understand if the author came, the idea of the word came, if there was some logic behind that word, or if it's just something like, oh, I'm going to name this blah, blah, So, but it's so much fun to have this room for creativity in our work. It's so interesting. And when I do that, I leave lots of notes for my editor so that we can discuss. And sometimes they have ideas and suggestions to make my ideas better. And welcome that. I think it's great, but it's fun. It happens a lot, especially with science fiction, fantasy books. It happens a lot.
I think one thing that can be very, very difficult to translate, because it's not just, you know, one word that doesn't exist, it's a whole thing that doesn't exist, is voice. So is that okay? So in this let me see, what was the, I have my word processor open. So I have a translation of a story called Into a Warm Cold Night, and it is about a sandstorm that brings four people together from different periods in time in a particular region in China. And so you have a Buddhist monk, someone who was on an oil expedition in like, you know, the 1950s peak of the Communist Party, and you know, a Martian from the future. So they all, you know, especially the Buddhist monk and the communist leader, they talk in very specific ways that are appropriate to their time periods. But these aren't necessarily ways of speaking that exist in English science fiction. So I had to really think about how I was going to translate voice without making it sound super cheesy, especially because in Chinese, there are a whole bunch of first-person pronouns that you can use to refer to yourself that, you know, some of them are kind of self-deprecating, and they're meant to show respect to the other person by belittling yourself in a way, which I feel like if you say that to like an English speaker, they're like, what kind of concept is that? You know? And in English, you just have I. Yeah. So sometimes I have to get around it by translating the rest of the sentence in a way where he comes off super humble because I only have I to work with, you know?
We have another question here from the audience. Fernanda Castro asks, how do you treat how people talk in case the author uses different accents, especially to differentiate between social classes, for example?
Wow. Good question. This is so hard. This is like, it is very hard to do this because I feel I have to find a way to mark the speech of the character, but I cannot use accents, because accents in Portuguese, they have nothing to do with accents in American accents or British accents or whatever, you know, any English speaking accent. And I usually try to find a way that's going to make the speech of that character very representative and very clear that that's the person who's speaking, but I try not to be prejudiced when I do this. Like, it would be a very poor solution to have a lower class character speaking wrong all the time. I mean, using wrong grammar. This is this would be too simplistic, and unless it's very clear in the original that this is the question, but in general, it's not. So we have to try to find creative ways to do this. It's very difficult, especially because in Portuguese, in English, the thing is, English is a phonetic language. I mean, the way you say things is very different from the writing. And Portuguese is a syllabic language. We write and we speak the same way we write. So we don't have the problems like you have in English, that the letter I can be pronounced as I or E depending on the word, like I, the pronoun, or fit. Like we don't have this in Portuguese, and so it's more difficult to mark speech in Portuguese because of this. And so we have to be very creative and try to find different ways. And every time I see this, I think, oh God, here it comes again.
Sometimes the difference comes in vocabulary. You know, in German, it's very usually to say that someone is higher classes when they use a lot of Latin things, you know, Latin based words. So to do this in Portuguese, we had to translate this in Portuguese is to choose another way to balance this, you know. How can this person will say that and choose a different vocabulary to establish that.
Yeah, I think as someone trained in sociolinguistics, especially, I'm very attuned to this question. It's something I do pay attention a lot to. And I think there are various ways of going about it. One way is to treat translation not just as translation, but as localization. So this means understanding what market you're translating for. Even if you're translating into English, is that US English? Is that UK English? Australian English? And within each of these countries, there's different ideas of language, different dialects, different, you know, just different groups of people that talk in their own way. So I kind of first started encountering this question when I was young and watching anime, because in Japan there's the Kansai accent, which is it's marked. It's not the default, and the characters kind of stand out if they speak that way. And there's often associations with, you know, ideas about personality and culture. So when these anime characters would get dubbed into US English, a lot of dubbers, their choice was to dub Kansai accents with US Southern accents, which has similar connotations. I mean, it's not a one-to-one relationship. That's just not how countries work, you know. Yeah. But the idea there is to consider what is this dialect supposed to represent in the original? Like, what are they trying to do by representing the language this way? And then you go to the target language and think, what are ways that this specific market codes that? You know, what are the different ways of speaking? And for some people, that's still very jarring. And for other people, it's also like, it becomes a question of you could be erasing culture. So it's a very complicated issue. And I don't know if there's any one particular solution that works better than others. Sometimes you don't translate the accent, you just change the vocabulary, you know. Sometimes there's a lot of ways to adapt it. And I think another thing is to really, this is why translating is an art, you know. It can't be automatic because we have to know so much, not just about the language, but the people. For example, Liu Cixin, who wrote the Three Body Problem series, he had a short story that was about the Large Hadron Collider in China. And, you know, so they had physicists running this experiment with this, you know, tech, and they had a Muslim character who was like a local shepherd. And, you know, the representation was problematic for a number of reasons. One of them being that this character would say, oh my God, but instead of God would say Allah, and Muslims don't do that. Like, you don't say, oh my Allah. That's not how I've never heard a Muslim say that. So I had to do research and see what are some actual phrases in Arabic that people use in this kind of situation. You know, sometimes instead of saying, oh my God, I would just translate it as, you know, or you know, like instead of, oh my God, it would be, what in the world is going on? You know, then you just work around it. Other times I did use an Arabic phrase, because you have to also understand, if I translate it faithfully to the original, I could be doing a damaging representation in the target language, because, you know, there are Muslim readers, and I have to be considerate of how any reader perceives the story. You know, it's you don't just think about the default reader, you know, the mainstream reader. You think about all readers, and that's a lot of cultural context to know.
So we have another question from the audience. Bruno Miller asked, have you ever had to go back to the beginning after translating a whole text because you noticed something in the end that changed everything?
Yes.
It's a good one.
Yeah, that, and I think that happened a lot, specifically in speculative fiction, because the when we write or when we read some horror fiction or something like that's a lot of turning points and plot twists. So it's kind of commonly to when we do all the things up and okay, we have to change something here, and and do that search in Microsoft Word and do this changings.
Yeah, for me, I've sometimes it can be it may seem as simple as one word, but actually it makes a big impact. For example, I have this story I translated by Tong Fei called, in Chinese, the character used, it means person, it could mean man, it could mean human, it means a lot of things. So initially I had translated the title as The Man Who Saw Cetus, the constellation, because the story was about this girl's relationship with her father. And he was the one who always believed that, he could go to this place and he claimed that he went and he had this picture of it and nobody believed him, basically. So, I'm working through this story thinking it's about the father. And then I get to the end and the girl gets on a spaceship and goes to see Cetus. And I'm like, it's not actually the man who saw Cetus. It's the person who saw Cetus, because it is about the father, but also the daughter. And if I had translated the title as The Man Who Saw Cetus, it would have kind of implicitly erased the story of the daughter. So something like that, it is such a one word, but it's actually so big in terms of the concept of the story.
Yeah. I've been through that also a couple of times, especially I think of fantasy books. Sometimes you think you understand something that the writer is starting to develop, and then after some time you get to see that the impression you got was not exactly right, especially if it's an invented world or anything that's not real. And sometimes you think, oh, okay, now I get this. So I have to go back and change some things because it was not very, very faithful to what the author was trying to say. Yeah. It also happened with gender. Mm-hmm. Like this is, I think most translators have been through this. I remember specifically a book that it was not speculative fiction, but there was a diary that there were some diary entries between chapters, and the writer wanted you to believe it was somebody, a girl, but then in the end, the plot twist, it was not the person you thought that was writing it. It was somebody else. But then I had to rewrite the diary entries because I couldn't use neutral pronouns because that was not the intention. And I could not use any gendered words. I had to rewrite the sentences so they didn't convey any kind of gender at all. Because you had to be, the reader had to go through the whole diary entries not knowing who was writing that. But like it could fit to any character. And so I had to go back and redo all of them when I understood that. It was like a 500 pages book, and I got that at the end.
Mm-hmm. We have another question from the audience. Kali is asking, have you ever had a translating decision overturned by your editors? How do you usually defend your choices?
I think I'm gonna have to go through my library real quick and check.
I don't remember any specific situation, but I have the habit of making comments on my translation to the editor whenever I find something that's really important to me. I don't do this all the time because there are some things that if they are changed, maybe it wouldn't make that much of a difference. But there are some things that I researched and I thought a lot about, and they are important to me. So I leave notes to my editor beforehand. I don't wait. Like whenever I send them the translation, my document already has the comments on the parts that I think are really important. And it's not that much, to be honest. I mean, it's only very specific things and it happens more in speculative fiction than in other kinds of books, because like a contemporary book does not have this kind of problem most of the times.
Yeah,
I've actually. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. I do leave some comment or notes like Regiane, and when okay, we have this another step after translation, and sometimes this translating editor gives us also some very, very good solutions. So I guess this team work goes through this challenging things, like specific things, but in general I do this. I leave some notes and justify my why did I do that. So like Regiane.
I think the one time that I got some like a little bit of feedback on the translation, well, because usually what happens is you know, most markets in the US, they don't have someone on staff who can read Chinese, you know. It's extremely rare. So you don't have someone who can compare the original to the final. So you don't have an editor who could say, did you translate this wrong? So that's why I don't get much feedback on the translations, because for the most part, there's no reference, you know. So the times that I have gotten feedback was when I did do novel length work that the company had another you know, Chinese reader who could vet the translation. And in that instance, it actually wasn't a sci-fi novel at all. It was contemporary. And the two pieces of feedback that I remember kind of standing out to me, one of them was just about like, saying that parking structure or parking garage or whatever, however I had translated it, was an unusual term. And you know, because which is kind of funny, because you know, the underground parking structures under like skyscrapers are very common in big Chinese cities, and they do exist in the US, but they're only in like very like dense city areas. You don't really see them in other places. So sometimes people are actually just unfamiliar with the, you know, like an English reader in the US might just be unfamiliar with the architecture, and that's why they find the term strange. But another instance was when, you know, the character in the text, you know, she had a gay roommate and she affectionately called him, you know, a name. And I translated it in English, faithful to what the original Chinese term means, but the reviewer felt that it was too harsh. And in that instance, you know, I was like, okay, I'll choose a different term, because in the end, it's not important to the story all that much. Like, why cause English-speaking readers to feel super offended when that wasn't the original intent? You know, I have to consider what my target audience is sensitive to, what they find offensive, which differs a lot between cultures.
Yes.
You know, one challenge that Ken Liu in particular has spoken about was the second book of the three body problem had some segments in it in the original that, you know, American English readers would find very sexist. So you know, there were revisions done to the English translation that don't exist in the Chinese. And so it really is a question of how much do I want to adapt the story to the target audience's expectations, because there's really like the target audience would react differently when that's not the intent, versus am I erasing or rewriting an author's work? That's a very big challenge and balance, and there's no one solution. It's a very, very each case.
We have here another question from the audience, and is connected with the question I prepared. Paulo Vinicius F. dos Santos asked, have you ever had to research something really strange for a translation? So I'd like to ask as well, what might surprise readers about the world of translating speculative fiction? What would you like people to know that they don't know much about?
I feel like I have learned so much science from translating Chinese science fiction, because in particular, the author, Gu Shi, she, I'll type her name in the chat 1 second. Where's my... she does very, very kind of high concept stories where she'll take an actual science thing and turn it into narrative. The novella I co-translated with Qiouyi Lu, it literally had a link to a biology journal paper about the research that was in the story, So I learned so much. And the thing is, I think a lot of people think that if you just sit there translating with a dictionary, you're going to be all good. It does not work like this. There's going to be a lot of terms that you will not find in the dictionary, or you find it in the dictionary and the translation is inaccurate because it didn't take into account specific context. And this is very, very much the case in science fiction, because these scientific terms are so specific that a general topic dictionary doesn't understand the nuances. So what I end up doing is I'll go to the Wikipedia page for the Chinese term, if I can find it, and then I'll click the English page. So it provides more context, and I can see on the English Wikipedia page, maybe there are multiple terms, maybe, maybe there's more context, or maybe even the Chinese concept doesn't overlap neatly with the English. So there's just so much of that you really have to negotiate as you're going along.
Yeah. My experience doesn't go through science so much because I've done science fiction, but not that much. But translating is researching every day. We research all the time. I mean, if somebody does not like to research, they cannot be a translator, because this is what we do most of the time. I mean, and sometimes the most unusual things pop up in books. You have to research about guns, about kinds of frogs, and then the other day it's about kinky sex practices, and then it's about hairstyles. I mean, each day is something different. And sometimes we joke that if somebody looked at my at the history of my browser, it's so weird because there are so many strange things that I have to research, and one thing leads to another. And I translated a nonfiction work that was about that was written by Caitlin Doughty. She's she worked in a crematory at the time, and then I had to research a lot about crematory practices and death rituals, and I spent 3 months researching about this all the time, and I had to look at pictures. It was weird, but fun. So it happens all the time. It's our everyday thing. It's normal. It's absolutely normal.
So we are heading to the end of our panel. So I'd like to ask the final question. As a writer, translator, and the contemporary scenario on speculative fiction, what kind of changes you've seen over the last years in terms of content, authors, themes? Are there any trends that you've noticed? What do you want to see in the future of genre fiction?
I would say that coming from the United States and seeing the literary scene on this end, it's been really great to see people show interest in translations because, you know, I think in China it's similar to Brazil in that a lot of the science fiction is like imported, translated stuff, you know. So in other countries, it is the norm to read stuff in translation. And it's actually the United States that stands out for not having that much translation,
Yes.
you know. And I think people in the US are actually beginning to understand this, which is amazing. And so, you know, the fact that there's interest in translation, that it's being valued more by markets, that people are looking for it, I think that's been really fantastic, because a lot of this work I never could have found when I was growing up. And, you know, even just like 15 years ago, you know, I couldn't have found a lot of these authors because they weren't even considered, you know. And I think another thing that is really interesting for our current time period is that we're much more able to contact the authors. It's still not really common to do that, but I mean, theoretically, you're able to, because, you know, we have email, we have social media. You're a bit more able to collaborate with the author to make sure that you are representing their intent. You know, in the past, people just couldn't communicate with the author, or the author had already, you know, passed away. So, you know, these days we have more channels for communication. And I think that's just enriching a more international community of genre fiction. I mean, there's still a lot of ways to go. And the US, I think a lot of people still, you know, they're very US centric. So there's a lot to unlearn there. But I think the fact that people are showing a lot of interest is very, very good.
Yeah, I think it goes the same way when we think about Brazil, because we do have lots of translations here, but we are also very US centered. I mean, we have massive translations by authors from the United States. And I've seen recently, some years ago, that the public is interested in writers from other countries and other languages. I mean, if other English-speaking countries, we usually have United States and England more often, but then we started having some room for Australian writers, Irish writers, but also from other languages. And I say this because I sometimes editors talk to me, oh, do you know somebody who translates from this or that language that's not the usual, not English or Spanish, which are more common here? And I think people are more interested in getting books, not only speculative fiction, but in general, from writers from other countries and other cultures and other experiences. So I think this is excellent, and this is amazing. We have to get contact with more cultures. We have to learn more. I think we have a lot to learn. I mean, Az is talking about the Chinese work she does, and I'm like very interested in Chinese work now, because it's so fascinating and it's so different from what we have, from our culture, from our way of doing things. And I think we only grow as individuals and as people, you know. If we get more contact and more input from other kinds of cultures and ways of thinking. The ways of thinking are so different. And so I think this is the best thing we're seeing. We have more and more foreign writers being translated, more languages, and there's more need for translators of different languages that are not English or Spanish.
Well, I've been noticing something that I think it's great, that more Latin American authors being translated to Portuguese. The last 3 or 2 years, we have like a wave of Latin authors going well here, and I think it's very interesting because we are all Latins, and this kind of exchange, I think this kind of exchange is very enriched. So and also I see more interest in other countries that are not well American or Europe centered. And that's why I've been very interested in Chinese now because of S. Yeah, now I'm very interested. I have learned Japanese, but not Chinese. So now I really want to know something in Chinese.
Yeah. And I think the expansion of the U.S. Markets horizons as well, it goes out to the other markets, because it's you don't really find people who translate Chinese to Spanish. I mean, I could theoretically do it, maybe. But what happens then is when you have these language combinations, that it's less common for people to know both. English is the piggyback language. So I've translated from Chinese to English, and my English version has been translated to Spanish. So, of course, that gets into different questions of, how much it varies from the original. But the point being, when there's more English too, that does also ripple out, because so many people speak English, that it's possible to further translate these works.
Yes.
Yeah.
So as we are almost out of time, I would like to ask you to say your last words, like what you're currently working on, what's next for you, if you have any book launch announcements, website, social media. So can we start with S?
Yeah, so my book, In the Watchful City, came out last August. I have that little QR code on my video to go to the page for it. I'm currently working on another novella, but I've got a day job, so that's been very slow progress. But I'm very active on Twitter. I can't guarantee the quality of my tweets, but I'm there, so you can follow me there for updates. And if you have questions about translation and kind of navigating that market, I'm happy to help as much as I'm able to.
Yeah, well, I've been translating a lot. I cannot tell you what, but there's a new Stephen King book coming next month, which I translated, which is a Conto de Fadas, fairy tale. And I'm very active on Twitter too. Some people know me from there. And I also talk a lot about translation, and I exchange ideas with people who want to be translators. And I love talking about this, so I'm always there. And I'm very happy to have been here. This has been great. This talk has been so much fun. It's so nice to exchange ideas with S and Úrsula and Juliana. It's been really great. I'm a very big fan of Relampeio, and I'm so pleased. Thank you.
Well, I'm translating something right now, but I cannot talk about it. But it's also fairy tale. So yeah, it's also fairy tale, but it's not Green Brothers fairy tale. Okay. And and as an author, I'm esqueci como é que fala, financiamento coletivo, in crowdfunding with another authors, and this crowdfunding is to fund a book that is Latin terrors. So we've made up together 20 legends and myths that came from Latin America, and we wrote about it. So you can see that in catarse.me terrores _latinos. And you all can find me in Instagram. I'm very active in Instagram, caros_livros. And I'm very, very glad to be here and to have this invitation. Really, I am a very fan of Regiane, so yeah, I'm kind of nervous. Thanks a lot.
It's been really great talking with everyone, and it's been really an honor to be invited and be able to speak to people. It's very important for me that the publishing market is both ways. I don't feel like it should just be people, coming to the US market. It should be us also looking to all the other markets. So it's been really great to be able to be here with the community.
And let's hope you can come to Brazil someday as an author to talk about your books in person.
So as we finish, I would like to call the translators in this panel. Kali de los Santos and Vanessa Guedes, and Ligia is here as well. And I would like to thank the elders, to thank my ancestry that brings me to this day, to thank all of you, as Regiane, Úrsula, Ligia, todo o pessoal que está aí por trás do Relampeio. And you can find me on social media, Juliana Vicente. And I'm very grateful for this panel, to be here with you today. Thank you for coming. We really do appreciate your participation in this panel. So,